It is Saturday the 1st of July, Canada Day. Canada today celebrates its 150th birthday, so happy birthday to Canada. I'm speaking to you from... Sorry, something in my eye there. I'm speaking to you from Abingdon in Oxfordshire, in the south of England. Abingdon is a small town about 7 miles due south of the city of Oxford. It is a warm and actually at the moment quite a sunny day today. Temperatures are about 22 degrees, which is an improvement on the last week. Having been almost boiled out of our skins 2 weeks ago, with temperatures in the mid-30s Celsius, we've now been enduring a week of temperatures around the 15 to 18 degrees Celsius mark. So we're back to a normal kind of temperature for this time of the year, which is very pleasant. And there's just a light breeze which is blowing through, which makes it all the more bearable. My name is Gerard, or Peter, or Boniface. I am a former monk and a former bus driver and a former teacher. I am a crocheter and a knitter and a weaver and a sewer, and this podcast is about my week in the world of fibre. So thank you for coming back if you're a returning viewer. Thank you for joining us if this is your first time. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe, and you'll be reminded when I upload future videos, which is approximately on a weekly basis, but it does tend to vary sometimes depending upon other factors. So getting down to business then. What am I drinking? Well, today I have a very nice peas porter, which is a very, well, the bottle describes it as a medium white. I would say it's actually quite a sweet white, but I really quite like sweet white wine. So this is a Moselle from central Germany, and it's a rather summery flavour, lots of flowers and citrus kind of tones to it, so it's quite fruity, but in a very light and refreshing kind of way, so cheers. Very nice. It goes very well with fish, which I've actually got fish for my evening meal today, so that's partly why I bought the wine. I've got a nice piece of sea bream for my supper. What else? I think that's it. So what we'll do then is, first things first, we'll move to my finished objects. I use objects as a plural because I've completed a pair of socks. Here they are. So previously I'd gotten an HO, half-finished object, but now I've completed its pair. And actually they more or less are a pair, which I'm quite pleased about. Although the colour on the toe is slightly different, because of the way the short rows worked out, I ended up going up the leg of the foot from approximately the same colour point, so it actually ended up, the bit that people will see above my shoe will look like a pair, which is quite nice that it worked out that way. I only have a small amount of yarn left over, so I possibly could have extended it by half a repeat more, but frankly I'm quite pleased I wasn't playing yarn chicken too much at the end. So all that remains to do with these now is to block them, by which I mean I will put some of my lavender soak into some hand-warm water, and I will put these in there, agitate them a little just to get them going, and then leave them for about 20 minutes until they're saturated, at which point I'll take them out and I will wrap them up in a bath towel and squeeze the water out of them rather than wring them, because the danger with anything that's made from wool is that if you wring it, it can end up what they call felting. The strands can start sticking together, and as you can see there is actually a halo from the smaller fibres of the wool around this, It's a 75-25 mix. The Air Valley Arran Flame colourway from West Yorkshire Spinners. And I think you can see that Flame adequately describes the colours. They're sizzlingly hot. And having squeezed the water out of the socks wrapped in the towel, I'll then have some cardboard cutouts for the size of my foot, which I'll put these onto, and that will then allow them to dry in the correct shape, stretched to the right extent, which wool has quite a strong memory, so it retains the shape when last it was wet. So as it dries, stretched out on the block, it will actually dry closer to the shape of my foot. And the fibres themselves will relax to a great extent, so everything is quite tight and tense at the moment, having been spun and then worked on, and everything needs to relax. I'm quite pleased with the regularity of the stitching. I'm really very happy with the way they've come out, but there are always one or two stitches which are a little bit looser than others, and the other advantage of blocking is that the stitches will kind of adjust themselves across the row and even out their tension. But given that these were knitted about 2 months apart, I'm actually quite pleased that they are more or less the same size. They're significantly narrower than my first socks, which were done in exactly the same way, but obviously as I've progressed with knitting, my tension has tightened up, which was probably not a bad thing. And I have tried them on. They do fit over my foot. The bind off is quite a stretchy bind off, because after binding off 2 stitches you then yarn over, so it just puts some extra elasticity in the top of the sock so that you can get your whole foot in there, which is what you need to do in order to be able to get the sock on your foot. So overall, very happy with those. Not quite finished in the sense that they had to be blocked, but all bar the shouting, they're completed. And that is my only finished object this week. I have been working on my cardigan, which is the Don's Day Off cardigan, which is crochet in what's called the herringbone stitch, and I've got to the point where I have actually made the yoke and done all the raglan increases, and I've brought the 2 bottom corners of the sleeve together, and I'm now working down the body, so I'm doing the front and the back and the other front. So that's the same on both sides, and I've marked the stitch for when I pick up for the sleeves to make those. I'm using a slightly heavier weight than the pattern called for. The pattern calls for a fingering weight yarn, which is 4-ply, and I'm using a DK weight yarn, which is 8-ply, because I wanted a heavier cardigan than was being advertised. But obviously, as a result of that, I've had to change the count, not so much horizontally. So the rows are the same length for the width, chest, and so on, and arms, but the length had to be altered. I don't need as many repeats to get the same length. So that's just something I'm noting as I go along, because if I make another one in another colourway, then I'll want to keep track of what stitches I'm using, and how many rows and how many stitches around and that kind of thing. I've tried it on. It's like a little bolero jacket really at the moment. But the other thing to notice is that there seems to be at this stage quite a wide gap between those 2 sides, and in fact they're not square sides, so they go across much more diagonally than that because of the way in which these things fit. So they more or less come across like this. But I would say that there is a band on each side about this size. So by the time it gets down to here, effectively, these are beginning to they will overlap. That's about the gap between them there is about the width that the band is. So both sides will have a band of the same width, and so it will actually come together quite nicely as a cardigan. So I'm not too worried about the seeming disparity, the gap between them. I did this morning. I sent a text message to my friend Wendy and said, I need to go to Mason's. And instead of her replying, no you don't, you've got plenty of wool, stop being so silly and, give... Instead, she said, oh, would you like me to come with you? So we went to Mason's, amongst other places, this morning, because I needed to get another ball of the main colour, which is this, which is also a West Yorkshire Spinners Air Valley yarn, but this is their Essential DK. It's also a 75-25 wool to nylon mixture, but this is, I don't know if this is blue-faced Leicester or what type of sheep the wool comes from for this. Very few details on the actual band, other than the basic information I've already given you. But I just wanted to have another one, and fortunately it's the same colour lot, so everything should be fine. So I'm quite pleased that I went and got that. But my real reason for going was, having finished that pair of socks, I want to cast on another pair. And my reason for that is I like to take projects with me when I go to work, for the journey, and sometimes for breaks at work and that kind of thing. And it's a lot easier to carry a sock with you, just because of the size. It's also easier to complete a single row on the sock, because even with the fingering weight yarn, that's only 32 stitches, whereas a jumper or whatever can be, well, 120, 150, 190 stitches, depending upon the weight of the yarn. And I've also bought quite a bit of sock yarn, and I really want to get making some of them up into socks now. So I was going to make the Just Follow pattern. And as you can see, they're yellow, so the idea is just follow the yellow brick road. And if you look very carefully at the leg, yes, you can just see on the picture there, it's actually little bricks in the pattern. So I think that's quite cute, and I quite like yellow. So we went, as I say, we went to Mason's and I bought that. But the reason I went was because I had bought this yarn with the intention of turning this into those socks. And it's quite an orange yellow, it's golden rather than sunshine yellow. But it's quite tonal, so there's a lot of depth of colour changes within the yarn. And I got the hank out this morning and made it into a cake. And as I was doing so, I realised that the thickness of this yarn is actually a really rather thick yarn. And I think it's actually even thicker than DK. Sadly, it doesn't give you the details on the label of the actual purported weight of the yarn. But I think that's actually a medium worsted weight yarn, which would be 10 ply. And the pattern for those socks calls for 4 ply. And with some DK weights are very thin, particularly with the wool. The wool tends to have finer fibres. So the way that they're spun, sometimes even a DK weight yarn can actually be quite a thin yarn. But that's quite a thick medium worsted weight yarn. So I wanted to buy a thinner yarn. So we went into Mason's, and one of the interesting things is how few yellow balls of yarn there actually are, particularly for socks, the 4 ply. But even in other, I mean, not so much. The Stylecraft acrylic range has several yellows within that range, and they were there, but they're DK and they're actually quite thick. Although they're a light worsted weight, they're close to the medium worsted weight end of things. And I also didn't want to be putting acrylic on my feet. I think if you're going to make socks, you do want to have as much natural fibre as possible with some other fibre like nylon, which will just prevent the wearing around the toes and the heels, which are the major parts of the foot to wear out quickly. But I did manage to find a 4-ply, and this is also 75-25. This is 75% superwash merino wool and 25% polyamide, which is just another form of acrylic. But as you can see, this is a lot thinner when compared to this yarn. If I can get that yarn to come up, yes, there we are. There we are. You can see that they are substantially different thicknesses. So, sorry, I'll just tidy that back up so it doesn't work loose. Don't want to have my balls of yarn unspooling whilst cakes of yarn unspooling whilst I'm trying to use them. I always work from the middle of a ball rather than the outside, just because it's easier to keep them in one place then. So I'll pop that down there. So I've actually caked one of those up. I bought two, there's one for each sock. This is quite a pleasant yellow, and I think this is actually probably closer to the yellow that was intended by the designer anyway. So I'm quite excited to get started with that, not least because I will be knitting this on my double-pointed needles, and I haven't yet used my double-pointed needles set. This is my Knit Pro double-pointed needle set, and so I bought a little while ago and intended to use for making socks. Now the pattern calls for 2.25mm. I have 2mm and 2.5mm, so I think I'll use the 2.5. They're quite small, which is a little bit not concerning, but it's going to take some getting used to. So I'm quite looking forward to using these. They're lovely things to touch, and I find that's half the battle when I'm taking up a new project, is the excitement and the keenness to actually use the equipment that I have bought. And part of that is the fact that they're so tactile. These are wooden, and they go I've got 2mm up to 4mm, as you can see. But the way they've been painted or stained really shows up the grain of the wood as well, but they're beautifully smooth items. So I'm really looking forward to using those. I've never used DPNs before now. Previously I've only knit on circulars, and I could knit these on circulars. There's nothing in the pattern that requires me to use DPNs, it's just that I haven't done yet, and I think I'd like to take that step. Oh, I didn't realise there's a very nice needle gauge in here, which I didn't know about. So I'm keen to take that next step and expand my repertoire somewhat, so I will give you an update next week, or next time certainly, on how I'm going. Of course, what I'd really love to be doing is using the yellow needles with the yellow yarn, but unfortunately they're 3mm needles, and that's just too big for the socks. So I think I'll be using the 2.5 instead of the 2.25. A quarter of a millimetre could make a difference, but actually with the way my gauge is quite tight, I think it will probably be okay. So, whilst I was in the mood of thinking about socks, I have down here my my lovely owl box, and I still have my lovely rainbow yarn mini hanks, from which I will be making the somewhere over the rainbow socks, which, as you can tell, will be a rainbow, so I'm quite looking forward to that. And then I also have this rather fine West Yorkshire Spinners yarn, which I just want to make sure, yes, this is also a fingering weight yarn, a 4-ply yarn, but the strengthening material in this. This is 80% wool and 20% mulberry silk. Although I'm not quite sure what other kind of silk there would be, because I thought silkworms lived on mulberry bushes anyway. So anyway, it is an 80-20. It's not coming across as well on the... You're getting a much more teal effect. I don't know. No, it's a shame you can't see this in the natural light. It is an emerald. It's a jewel-like tone, and it is so unbelievably soft and squishy. And I'm really looking forward to having a pair of socks in this. The Emerald City sock also has a pattern, but it's patterned along the instep rather than... I don't know if you can... It's kind of zigzag pattern on the sock, which carries on down the instep. So I'm quite looking forward to working on those after I've finished my emeralds. The Follow the Yellow Brick Road sock. I'm really looking forward to working with this. I can't tell you how. It's so nice to touch. Although it's 80% wool, it has none of that crunchiness. You wouldn't know this is wool. It is like silk. Fibres in my mouth, I'm afraid. That's always the downside of using wool. But I'm quite looking forward to using that as well. So, yes, that's where we are with that. Whilst I was in Masons, I also had half an eye out for some wool for a mystery knit-along that I'm taking part in. And I needed 3 complementary colours, really. So I'd chosen this purple, magenta and lavender. And I also needed a contrast colour. Well, I still have quite a lot of that honey, the natural kind of colour there, which is quite a contrast to those 3. So I don't know what it's going to look like when it finishes, because it's a mystery knit-along. I will give you updates during the month as I'm doing it, and we'll see where we are in a month's time. But I really like these West Yorkshire Spinners wool. I am actually knitting this, so I will be able to confirm the impression of whether it's better to crochet with this wool than to knit with it. I really don't understand why it would be difficult to knit with it. I mean, as I say, it is a little bit crunchy, but the yarn itself is... The only comment I would make about this is because it's got all the halo, and possibly because of the way in which it's not a very tight twist on the ply, it's very easy with the hook to split the yarn, so it'll be interesting to see how I cope with the needles on this. But I'll give you an update. I'll let you know how things are progressing, and that's what I'm doing, so it will be interesting to see where we are. And I also was watching this morning the Grocery Girls podcast, but yesterday I watched their Craftsy series, Off Our Needles, and within that they were talking about homemade dishcloths, and I saw dishcloth cotton. It's remarkably cheap. It's £1.99 for 100 grams. I don't know why. What makes it so inexpensive compared to other cottons that are available? But they had 3 patterns. They highlighted a designer who has produced 2 sets of 3 patterns. One is geometric patterns, a square within a square, then 4 squares within a square, and then 9 squares within a square. So it's 1 squared, 2 squared, and 3 squared. And the other was just different kind of garter patterns going on the diagonal within the squares. And she reckons you can get 3 patterns from a 100-gram ball of cotton, So I'll give them a go, see how that goes. The grocery girls themselves said that once you've actually used a homemade dishcloth, you never want to go back to any other form of dishcloth. So again, I will put that to the test. I will make some, use them, and then let you know. Of course, it doesn't just have to be a dishcloth, it can actually be a face cloth, flannel, as it were, for using in the shower and that kind of thing, for defoliating. So I may use one for personal use and then the other two for kitchen use. But I'll give you an update, let you know how I get on with them and what they like to use at the end, because I think they themselves have recommended these patterns as being very simple and straightforward, and they themselves recommend using homemade dishcloths. It will be interesting to see whether it's worth the effort. But it's just a different kind of pattern, a different kind of project. It'll be fairly quick because they're just, squares of so big, so it's not going to take a month of Sundays to complete. So cheers. So in terms of other acquisitions, the other one that I didn't mention last week is this teacup and saucer that have been sitting in plain view for the last 20 minutes or so. Is it 20 minutes? 30 minutes nearly. Another one of my teacups and accompanying teapots. Obviously this is a Christmas pudding themed teapot, so I will be putting this away in my kitchen cupboard and we'll get it out in the lead up to Christmas and to use over Christmas and the New Year. It's quite sweet, it's quite a pretty little novelty teapot and cup. I do have from Waitrose, they do a spiced apple and a winter lemonade tea, and they're herbal infusions really. And they are really delicious, really very delicious, and of course they would go very happily with this set. So I got that in a local charity shop. I think that was Cancer Research UK, and it was just for a few pounds, so it's no great expense. But I do like my little teacups and teapots. I have another acquisition, which I didn't buy. It was actually given to me by Wendy. And it's this, which is actually, when you take out the under part, if I can do it on camera, is actually a storage container with lid. And it has a base which will make it firm as well. So that's really rather nice. I thought about putting some wool in there, but actually it's quite tall, and at the moment I have a small footstool which has my magazines in, and they will actually stand up quite happily in here, which will also give it a degree of support for standing up. And then I can use the footstool for other things, particularly I think the embroidery. I've not really got cracking on the cross-stitch and embroidery work yet, but I do have a couple of kits and I do want to start working on that, and they're currently sharing the footstool with all my magazines, so if I put my magazines in here, then it will make space for the embroidery to go in the footstool, so that's quite nice. So that is pretty much it in terms of finished objects and works in progress and acquisitions. So we come to the kind of recommendations section, really. So I've already mentioned them twice. Well, no, this will be the second time I've mentioned them. The Grocery Girls are... The podcast is extremely funny. They're sisters whose parents own a grocery shop in Edmonton, Alberta, and they both knit, and they do a side-by-side podcast, and it's very funny. They're lovely people. Tracy and Jodie. Jodie is quite an earthy character and doesn't really have boundaries about what she isn't prepared to share. So it can sometimes be quite... anyway, I'm sure you understand. But they also have, on the Craftsy channel, a podcast which is considerably shorter. Their main podcast lasts about an hour and a half and is every 2 weeks. They're in their second series of their Craftsy podcast, which is about half an hour an episode, and that comes out every week for about 6 weeks. And I find them very entertaining. I find them very interesting. I seem to like a lot of the things that they like, so I find that if I follow their recommendations, as I have done today, for example, then I'm rarely disappointed by those recommendations. So I can thoroughly recommend them as someone to follow. And of course, being Canadian, they're celebrating today. They recorded their podcast yesterday but uploaded it today, so that kind of reminded me it was Canada Day today. In terms of TV, Doctor Who is coming to its conclusion. I watched last week, and the episode was every bit as gripping as I'd hoped it was going to be, with every ounce of the body horror that I'd hoped there was going to be. It's the question and answer session following didn't actually tell us who the new Doctor was going to be. They are currently filming the Christmas episode, so they will be filming in the next few days the new Doctor. Whether they're going to try and keep it a secret until the big reveal, I don't know. I mean, part of me hopes that they do and are able to, because it's much more exciting that way. Sometimes finding things out before they've actually happened. I understand the pressures on a broadcaster to tease the public into watching. But at the same time, it takes something away from the way the episode is designed. You know, the writer and the director have spent a lot of time and energy teasing the viewer, leading them up the garden path, and sometimes the wrong garden path, before the big reveal. But if you've read that week's Radio Times, you already know what the big reveal is, so it takes away something of the pleasure. Although anticipation of what is going to come can replace some of that pleasure, so it's not by any means a deal breaker. But if they're able to keep it secret right up until the day, first of all, I would be very surprised, and second of all, I'd be delighted. I somehow don't think they're going to. There may be some kind of announcement after this episode. We'll have to wait and see. So that's coming to an end, but Game of Thrones is about to begin. So we're about to find out if winter is coming and who is going to be ruler of Westeros, and how, and who else is going to be killed, and are we now down to the final few and it's a case of the last woman standing, almost, because most of the main competitors now are female. So yeah, obviously as that starts, I'll talk a little bit about that. I understand that this season is a shorter season because they've actually split it into two and made the next season as well. So it won't be the full 10 episodes. It will, I think, be 6 episodes and then 6 episodes as the great climax. But, you know, we'll see. They may change their mind. You never know with the networks. They sometimes realise they can stretch things out longer and prolong the agony. It's an enjoyable kind of agony, but it is agony nonetheless. So the final recommendation today is an interesting book. It's called Jerusalem, the Biography, by Simon Sebag Montefiore. Simon Sebag Montefiore is a historian, and the brother of Hugh Sebag Montefiore, who's also a historian as well. And he's done a few documentary series on the BBC, mostly for BBC 4, but they may have been shown on BBC 2. One of which was on Jerusalem, and this is the book on which he based the TV series. And it's a different approach because it's treating Jerusalem as a character rather than as a place. And it's well worth reading. I've actually dipped in it before, but it's really fascinating history. Now, the Sebag Montefiores are a Sephardic Jewish family, and the Montefiores are quite famous in a number of areas, but finance historically being one of them, unsurprisingly. And it led me to think, actually, a couple of things, really. The first is how much Judaism and Islam are religions of the place, far more so than Christianity, and notwithstanding the Crusades, for which there were a number of reasons for them happening. It's obviously well known that Jews pray facing Mecca, which itself wasn't the original direction of prayer, but it became later the direction of prayer, because Jews used to, Muslims used to pray facing towards Jerusalem rather than facing Mecca. But eventually it became Mecca and the Kaaba. And for Jews, the sense of the Holy Land, and next year in Jerusalem for the Passover and the like. So the notion of place plays a significant part in the religious practices of Jews and Muslims, to a much greater extent than for Christians. And part of the reason for that, I think, is that for Christians, every place where there was a church became a mini Jerusalem. Historically, liturgically, Catholic churches always are oriented on an east-west axis, with the altar towards the east, towards the rising sun, ad oriens. And certainly in English churches, the names of these locations actually give themselves away. So you go into the church via the Galilee porch, and on the left of the Galilee porch, historically, was the font, the River Jordan, where Jesus was baptized, where babies are baptized. And then you go into the main body of the church, which is the chosen people, and you go to the altar and up the steps to the sacrifice of Calvary, which is the cross on the mount at Jerusalem, outside the gates. And so you've actually got this sense that the Holy Land has been shrunken down and is now encompassed by the walls of the church. And so the nave where the people sit leads through to the temple. And in fact, it's an impression you get even more in Orthodox churches, where they have what they call the iconostasis, which in Catholic churches used to be the rood screen, which separated off the people from the altar. And so, like the Jewish high priest going into the Holy of Holies to sacrifice on the altar there, directly into the presence of God, so the Orthodox and the Catholic priest goes through the rood screen, through the iconostasis, the wall of saints, into the heavenly Jerusalem, where the sacrifice of Christ on Calvary is offered to the Father. And so it's an interesting... for me, it's an interesting thing that although, as I say, there was the Crusades, which were an attempt to retake the holy places back from the infidels, the Mohammedans, what we now would call Muslims, the Saracens. Part of the reason for the Crusades was also the second sons of nobles who had no lands to inherit had to go elsewhere to look for lands to become kings and nobles. So, I mean, it isn't a simple, let's take back what is ours. But I don't want to overstress it, because medieval Christianity in particular did also have a strong tradition of pilgrimage. So a local place which took the place of the holy shrines in the Holy Land, because it was not feasible for most people to be able to travel to the Holy Land to make a pilgrimage. But it means that a place like Jerusalem, in particular, is fiercely contested. It's even today, in a largely post-religious world. Well, in a world where the richest 80% of the people in the world don't have any faith of any kind, particularly, even if they only make up 20% of the world's population, 25% of the world's population. The role of the Holy Land, and the role of Jerusalem in particular, as the touchstone of faith, and therefore as the flashpoint for violence between not just different religious communities, so not just between Muslims and Jews and Christians, but within those communities, so between Sunnis and Shias, between Catholics, Orthodox, Armenians and Copts and all the rest of it. And there is fierce rivalry in these shrines, which is... it disedifies, it's destructive, it knocks down the edifice of belief, because people of faith act like brats. It's one-upmanship, it's constant jockeying for position, it's constant niggling at each other, trying to make the others, not satisfied with what you have, trying to make what others have be less than it is. And of course then you mix into that the idiocy, and that's not too strong a word, of the current President of the United States talking about moving the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, even though Jerusalem is acknowledged as the disputed capital of the Palestinian territory, as well as the claimed capital of Israel, although Israel actually has its capital at Tel Aviv, because if we want a conflagration and a bloodbath, let's be so stupid as to move our embassies to Jerusalem and all that entails. So it's worth knowing something of the history of this city and the role it has played through the centuries. Even in the post-Jewish centuries, perhaps particularly in the post-Jewish centuries, as Christians and then Muslims and then Christians and Muslims have fought over and disputed claims to various parts of the sites, but also, and commending Islam here, the rulers, the various sultans and latterly kings of Jordan, who were the protectors of the holy places, protecting the holy places of Christianity for Christians as well, partly because Islam sees Jesus as some form of prophet for their own religion, but because they are a sacred site in themselves for another faith. And, you know, we don't hear enough about that side of Islam sometimes. We only hear about the intolerant and aggressive side of Islam, which is certainly there, but is there equally with Christianity. And since the Second World War, and perhaps understandably, therefore, the modern state of Israel and modern Jewry as well. I do find it interesting that even though I'm quite a relaxed and modern person, I still find it difficult to describe someone as a Jew. I have a very good friend who is an Orthodox Jew, and I've never felt comfortable describing him as a Jew. I've always prefaced it or qualified it with he's an Orthodox Jew, making it more about the religious identity than the cultural identity. And, you know, this goes back centuries, the Nazi pogroms of the 1930s, but going back through all of European history, the way in which Jews have been treated as second-class citizens. And within the church as well. On Good Friday, in the Catholic Church, there are the general intercessions of the church, and they all have little headlines for the church, for the Pope, for the people of God, and then for the perfidious Jew. Now, it says perfidios Judaeus because it's in Latin. Perfidious in Latin does not mean what perfidious in English means. So what the church meant was, by perfidious Jew, was the unbelieving Jew, the faithless Jew, not the faithless Jew in the sense that you can't trust them, but the faithless Jew in that the Jew that didn't believe in the Messiah. But we still prayed for them, and it's perhaps a salutary lesson in making language clear, that you need to make people understand what you're actually saying, not allow them to think they know what you're saying. Because a lot of, and I don't need to wax this point at all, a lot of terrible harm has been done to Jews through the centuries by Christians. Despicable, terrible things have been done. And what makes it worse by any stretch is the fact that it's based upon a misapplied, misunderstood word. Which in 1962, the Second Vatican Council, which is often derided by conservative Catholics, and with some cause in some cases, but the assembled bishops with the Pope there made it clear that the Jews bore no responsibility for the death of Christ, any more than any other group. Yes, they were the people of God at the time, and let's not forget, that includes the apostles, that includes the Virgin Mary, that includes everyone who was the first Christians, the first followers of Christ after Pentecost. So it's been an uncomfortable part of European Christendom. The mistreatment and misunderstanding about the role of the Jews and their role in salvation history and their role in the modern world. So this kind of conclusion is a twofold thing, that we just need to always check that what we think we know is actually what we do know, that what we think something is saying is actually what it is saying, that we ourselves actually say the things we mean and make it clear that we don't mean something else within that. Language, even precise language, can be ambiguous, and can also be taken hold of and misused by people who basically have got an axe to grind and it's just grist to the mill. But this is a really good book. If you haven't read it, I do thoroughly recommend it. It's not easy reading in the sense that it's quite involved. There are a lot of foreign names and places and facts and details, but it's actually very well written. It's quite gripping. It does read like a biography. You can actually see the identity of Jerusalem develop and change from the time before David, through King David and the kings of Solomon after the building of the temple, and the kings of Judah, the despoiling of the temple, the abomination set up by Alexander the Great's successor, Antiochus Epiphanes IV, the re-establishment of the temple under the Maccabees, the rebuilding of the temple under Herod the Great, the destruction of the temple after the Jewish wars, the way in which Islam adopted the temple site as a holy site within their own faith for the ascension and transportation of Muhammad, sorry. So, there's an awful lot going on in there, and it's well worth a read, and I thoroughly recommend it. So after that rather wandering discourse, I think, where are we? Yes, we're on 50 minutes, so I'm not shortchanging anybody. Far be it from me to not give people enough of a listening. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and if you have any comments, please let me know, and I'm sure to answer any questions that you may have. And once again, thank you for listening, and I'll see you again the next time. Bye.